Willa Prentiss Boone was 28 years old and standing on a rain-slicked dock with everything she owned wrapped in a single oilcloth bundle when her late father's creditors finished dividing up the last of what she'd once believed was her inheritance. Her father's own brother, a calculating man named Reuben Boone, who had co-signed her father's final, disastrous shipping venture and then maneuvered himself into position as executor of the estate once that venture collapsed and her father's heart gave out from the strain of it, had seen to it that Willa received nothing beyond a small trunk of clothes and the $5 he considered a generous parting gift for a niece he no longer wished to house. With that $5, standing in the fog-bound Maine harbor town of Gull's Rest, Willa did what the entire waterfront considered an act of plain desperation. She bought the abandoned Comfort Point Light, a decommissioned lighthouse the Lighthouse Board had shuttered 9 years earlier and left to the gulls and the weather, sold to her outright because not a single soul in 3 counties wanted the crumbling old tower and the keeper's cottage attached to it. She could not have known, climbing those spiral stairs for the first time with salt wind screaming through broken glass, that sealed behind a false section of the cottage wall waited a letter that had spent 9 years in darkness, one that would change not only her own fortunes, but the fate of every family still grieving along that stretch of coast. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Willa Prentiss Boone. If you have ever stood at the edge of everything and chosen to build rather than break, tell us in the comments. We'd be honored to hear it. Willa had grown up not in Gull's Rest, but 100 miles up the coast, in a fishing town called Merrow Head, the only daughter of a lighthouse keeper named Josiah Prentiss, who tended the Merrow Head Light for the better part of 30 years before his death, and a mother, Adeline, who had died when Willa was still a small child, leaving father and daughter to build a life together in the particular isolation and intimacy that a lighthouse family knows better than almost any other kind. Josiah Prentiss was not a demonstrative man, but he was a patient and thorough one, and he raised his daughter the only way he knew how to raise anyone under his roof, which was to teach her everything he understood about the sea, the light, and the long, careful discipline of keeping both running true through weather that broke lesser structures and lesser resolve alike. By the time Willa was 10, she could trim a wick and polish a lens well enough to pass her father's exacting inspection, and by 15, she had stood more night watches beside him than most assistant keepers twice her age, learning to read the particular moods of fog and swell that told a keeper whether a night would pass quietly or whether ships out past the point would need every candle power the light could throw. It was not only the mechanics of lighthouse keeping that Josiah passed to his daughter, though that trade would prove essential in ways neither of them could have predicted. It was a conviction he held with the same steadiness he brought to the light itself, spoken to Willa often enough across the long, quiet hours of night watch, that it became as much a part of her as her own name. That a lighthouse keeper's true duty was not merely to burn a flame, but to keep faith with people he would never meet, sailors and fishermen and passengers whose names he would never learn, who depended entirely on his diligence during the very hours when no one was watching to see whether he kept it. "The sea doesn't care whether anyone's grading your work, Willa," he told her once, during a black November gale that had them both awake and working through the small hours to keep the lamp burning against wind that seemed determined to snuff it. "You do the work because the work is owed, whether or not a soul on earth ever thanks you for it." Willa absorbed this lesson the way children absorb the deepest truths of the households that raise them, without fully grasping its weight, until circumstances later demanded she live by it. Her father taught her something else in those years too, a practical skill that seemed at the time merely useful and would later prove indispensable. He taught her to read and maintain the Lighthouse Board's meticulous logbooks, the daily records every keeper was required to keep of weather, ship traffic, supply deliveries, and any incident along the coast worth noting, records Josiah Prentiss approached with the same reverence he brought to the light itself, insisting that an honest, complete log was as much a keeper's duty as a clean lens or a full oil reservoir. "A log doesn't forget what a man might rather forget," he told her, showing her how to enter each night's events in his own careful, economical hand. Years from now, when memory's gone soft and convenient, the log still says exactly what happened. Willa grew into young womanhood at Merrow Head, with these two convictions woven into her. that unwitnessed duty mattered as much as witness duty, and that a careful written record could outlast any comfortable forgetting a community might later prefer. Josiah Prentiss died in the winter of 1888, felled by a lung ailment that had crept up on him gradually through decades of damp coastal air, and Willa, 26 years old and having known no other life, found herself without a position, since the Lighthouse Board's rules of that era made no allowance for a daughter to simply inherit her father's post, however capable she had proven herself over 15 years of unofficial service beside him. She left Marrowhead that spring for her Uncle Reuben's household in Gull's Rest, the only family remaining to her, having been told by well-meaning neighbors that a young woman without prospects was fortunate indeed to have a blood relation willing to take her in. Reuben Boone, her father's younger brother, had built a modest but genuine success as a shipping agent along the Gull's Rest waterfront, and Willa spent nearly 2 years in his household keeping his own business ledgers, a skill she'd absorbed alongside her father's logbook discipline, believing herself to be, if not beloved, at least useful and secure. That security proved illusory. Reuben Boone, it emerged only gradually over Willa's 2 years under his roof, had entangled himself in an increasingly reckless series of shipping investments through the late 1880s, chasing the kind of speculative profits that periodically swept through New England coastal commerce and periodically ruined the men who chased them too eagerly. He had, without Willa's knowledge, used her late father's modest remaining savings, held in trust for her, and administered by Reuben as her nearest male relation, as collateral against one such venture, a shipment of manufactured goods bound for southern markets that Reuben was certain would return handsome profits, certain enough that he pledged not only his own capital, but the entirety of his niece's small inheritance against the venture's success. The venture failed catastrophically in the autumn of 1889, the ship lost in a storm off Hatteras, along with its cargo, and Reuben Boone, facing creditors of his own, found in the wreckage of his finances a solution that cost him nothing but a niece's trust. He settled his most pressing debts using what remained of Willa's inheritance, a maneuver his position as trustee made legally, if not morally, available to him, and informed Willa afterward, with the particular smoothness of a man rehearsing an unpleasant speech, that circumstances had left him unable to continue supporting a niece who brought no income into his household, and that she would need to make her own way going forward. He gave her, by way of parting settlement, $5, framing it as the last remaining fragment of her father's estate he could in good conscience release to her, though Willa understood, standing in his parlor with that meager sum in her palm, that it was considerably less than honest accounting would have owed her, and considerably more than Reuben felt any real obligation to provide. She did not argue, having learned in 2 years under his roof that arguing with her uncle accomplished nothing beyond exhausting herself against a man who had already decided the outcome before the conversation began. She packed her small trunk, thanked him with a courtesy she did not entirely feel, and walked down to the Gull's Rest waterfront to consider, for the first time in her adult life, a future with no lighthouse, no father, and almost no money standing between herself and genuine destitution. It was on the waterfront, in the days that followed, listening to the idle talk of fishermen and dock workers the way she had once listened to her father's careful accounts of coastal happenings, that Willa first heard mention of the Comfort Point Light, a decommissioned lighthouse standing on a rocky spit some 3 miles up the coast from Gull's Rest, its light extinguished for good 9 years earlier when the Lighthouse Board, citing the construction of a newer, more powerful light on a neighboring headland, had deemed Comfort Point redundant and shuttered it in 1881. The tower and its attached keeper's cottage had sat empty ever since, the board having sold the property outright rather than maintain a structure it no longer needed, and the buyer, Willa learned through the waterfront's efficient gossip, had been a local merchant who'd hoped to convert the cottage into a summer letting property, a scheme that had never materialized before the merchant's own death left the property tangled in an unresolved estate, unwanted and untouched for years since. The fisherman spoke of Comfort Point with the particular mixture of superstition and practical dismissal. Coastal communities often reserve for abandoned structures near the water. Some said the point was unlucky, having claimed at least one keeper's assistant to a fall from the tower stairs some years before its closure, Others simply noted that the building had gone to ruin and wasn't worth a sensible person's money or effort. Willa listened to all of this with an attention the fisherman mistook for idle curiosity, but which was, in truth, something closer to recognition. She understood lighthouses in a way none of the men gossiping over their nets could match. Understood that a tower's soundness had little to do with whether its light still burned. And she found herself walking the 3 miles up the coast road the following morning, simply to see the place with her own trained eye, before she allowed herself to hope for anything. What she found, standing before Comfort Point Light in the gray morning fog, was a structure that had clearly suffered 9 years of neglect, but whose fundamental construction, the thick granite block tower and the sturdy, if weathered, keeper's cottage beside it, remained exactly the kind of solid, deliberate work the Lighthouse Board had always demanded of its stations, work built to withstand exactly the punishing coastal weather that had since been left to batter it unchecked. The lantern room's glass stood broken in several panes. Gulls had claimed the gallery as a roosting ground, and the cottage's door hung loose on a single hinge, but the tower's granite walls showed no sign of the structural failure that would have made the place genuinely dangerous, only the surface damage of long neglect. She inquired at the county recorder's office and learned that the tangled estate had finally cleared probate the previous year, the property reverting to a distant, disinterested heir who had authorized the county to sell it for whatever it could fetch, simply to be rid of an asset generating nothing but tax obligations and complaints about its deteriorating condition. The recorder, a weary man clearly more interested in clearing his books than securing top value, named a price of $5 for the whole property, tower, cottage, and the rocky point itself, provided the buyer understood the county offered no guarantee as to the structure's condition and no assistance whatsoever in restoring it. Willa paid every cent she had left in the world for it that same afternoon, and word of the transaction traveled the short distance back to Gull's Rest waterfront, with the predictable speed of small-town gossip, so that by the time she walked back up the coast road toward her new property, she carried with her the settled reputation, among Gull's Rest's fishing families, of the strange, desperate young woman who'd spent her last $5 on a cursed, crumbling lighthouse nobody sensible would touch. She spent her first days at Comfort Point, simply making the cottage livable, clearing gull droppings and storm debris from its 2 small rooms, mending the loose door as best she could, with tools scavenged from a small shed behind the cottage, and discovering, with the particular satisfaction of someone returning to familiar work after years away from it, that the tower's spiral stairs remained entirely sound beneath the broken glass and general disrepair of the lantern room above. It was on her 4th day, working to clear a section of the cottage's back room where water damage had caused the plaster to bulge and crack along one wall near the old iron stove, that she noticed the damaged plaster gave way to reveal, beneath its surface, not the expected lath and stud construction, but a section of wall noticeably thicker than its neighbors, with seams too regular to be simple settling damage. She worked at the cracked plaster with growing curiosity, and within the hour had exposed a shallow recessed cavity built into the wall's thickness, sealed originally behind a thin panel of matching wood that had swollen and cracked with 9 years of coastal damp, and inside that recess, wrapped in oiled canvas that had mostly preserved its contents against the moisture all around it, a bundle of papers and a small tin case. Willa sat on the cottage's bare floor with that bundle in her lap for a long moment before she found the composure to examine it properly, understanding already, from the deliberate care of its concealment, that whatever she'd found had been hidden by someone who never intended it to sit forgotten behind a wall for nearly a decade. The papers, when she finally unwrapped them, proved to be a set of personal logbook pages written in a hand she did not recognize, but which followed the same careful, methodical format her own father had used throughout his career, dated across several months in the autumn and winter of 1880 and 1881, the very period, she realized with a chill, immediately preceding Comfort Point's official closure. The pages had belonged, their content made clear within the first several entries, to the Light's final keeper, a man named Elijah Marsh, and what emerged from his careful, increasingly troubled notations was a story considerably darker than the simple bureaucratic redundancy the Lighthouse Board's official history had recorded. Marsh's entries documented, in the dry, factual language his training demanded, a pattern of supply shortfalls through that final autumn that he found increasingly difficult to explain through ordinary circumstance. Oil deliveries arriving consistently short of the quantities recorded on the accompanying manifests, replacement lamp components that never arrived at all despite repeated requests, and a persistent, worsening problem with the light's actual brightness that Marsh attributed, in entry after entry, not to any fault of his own maintenance but to oil of noticeably inferior quality being delivered in place of the standard-grade fuel his station was entitled to under its supply contract. Marsh's entries grew steadily more pointed through November and December of 1880, documenting his written complaints to the district supply office, complaints that went unanswered, and his growing suspicion, stated with the same restrained factuality he brought to weather observations, that the discrepancies were not administrative error, but deliberate diversion, someone along the supply chain skimming both oil and equipment meant for Comfort Point and several neighboring stations, replacing genuine materials with cheaper, inferior substitutes and pocketing the difference in cost. He named, in an entry dated early January of 1881, the district supply contractor responsible for provisioning that stretch of coast, a man named Orrin Tuttle, and noted, with careful precision, specific discrepancies between delivery manifests and actual received quantities across 4 consecutive months, exactly the kind of methodical documentation a keeper trained to distrust convenient forgetting would compile before making a formal accusation. The final entries, dated the last week of January 1881, described a night of thick fog and heavy swell, during which the light, running on the substandard oil Marsh had been documenting for months, failed to burn at sufficient strength to be seen at the distance required, a failure that Marsh recorded, in language that remained factual but could not entirely conceal his anguish, coincided with the loss of a coastal packet ship, the Abigail Rose, which struck the rocks near Comfort Point that same night, with the loss of 11 souls aboard, including, Marsh noted with particular grief, a family of 5 emigrants bound for relatives in Portland. Marsh's final entry, dated 2 days after the wreck, recorded his intention to formally report the supply diversions to the Lighthouse Board's district superintendent directly, bypassing the local supply office entirely, along with his conviction that the wreck of the Abigail Rose was a direct consequence of the compromised fuel he had been forced to burn against his own repeated warnings. Willa found, tucked inside the small tin case alongside the logbook pages, a final, separate letter, this one addressed not to any official, but simply, "To my wife, should matters go badly for me," written in the same hand, but considerably less restrained than the formal log entries, in which Elijah Marsh confided his fear that Orrin Tuttle, upon learning of his intention to report the diversions formally, might move to silence him before that report could be filed. Whether through influence with the Lighthouse Board or through more direct means, Marsh did not specify but clearly feared. He wrote that he was hiding both the logbook pages and this letter behind the cottage wall as insurance, trusting that if anything happened to prevent him from delivering his report in person, someone would eventually find the truth he'd so carefully documented. 2 weeks after that final entry, the official record showed, Elijah Marsh had been dismissed from his post for what the Lighthouse Board's file described only as conduct unbecoming a keeper, a vague charge that Willa now understood, reading it against Marsh's own careful documentation, bore the unmistakable signature of a man being discredited and silenced rather than genuinely disciplined. Comfort Point Light was decommissioned within the year, officially for reasons of redundancy, though Willa now suspected the wreck of the Abigail Rose, and the scandal it might have exposed had considerably more to do with the timing than the board's official explanation ever acknowledged. Willa sat with these discoveries for the better part of that evening, understanding, with the same clear-eyed practicality her father had trained into her, that she held something that could either be quietly forgotten in the same darkness that had swallowed it for 9 years, or could reopen a wound 11 families along that coast had carried since the Abigail Rose went down. Families who had presumably been told, as the official record suggested, that the wreck was simple misfortune, a night of bad weather and worse luck, rather than the consequence of documented, preventable negligence someone had worked deliberately to conceal. She thought of her father's voice, steady across 100 shared night watches. "You do the work because the work is owed, whether or not a soul on earth ever thanks you for it." This was not the keeper's work she'd been trained to. Not directly, but she understood it as an extension of the same principle, that a true record, once found, created an obligation to see it properly delivered, regardless of how much easier silence might prove. She moved carefully in the weeks that followed, aware that she was, in the eyes of Gull's Rest, still merely the strange young woman who'd bought a cursed lighthouse with her last $5, a position from which sweeping accusations against a presumably still influential supply contractor would carry little weight without careful corroboration. She began by seeking out Elijah Marsh's widow, learning through patient inquiry at the county church registry that Marsh himself had died some 4 years after his dismissal, broken, neighbors recalled, by the loss of his position and the cloud of vague scandal that had followed him from Comfort Point, but that his widow, Sarah Marsh, still lived, now remarried under a different name, in a small town some 20 miles inland, having left the coast entirely after her first husband's death, rather than continue living beneath the shadow his dismissal had cast over their family. Willa traveled to see Sarah Marsh the following week, and found a woman in her 50s, guarded at first but visibly moved once Willa produced the logbook pages and the letter, tears coming to her eyes, as she confirmed that her late husband had always maintained, privately and to the end of his life, that he had been dismissed unjustly to protect men more powerful than himself, though he had never been able to prove it, and had eventually stopped speaking of the matter publicly after his complaints were met, more than once, with thinly veiled warnings that continued agitation would only worsen his family's already precarious situation. Sarah Marsh possessed, it transpired, a small collection of her husband's personal correspondence from that final year. Letters to his brother describing his growing alarm over the supply situation in language that corroborated the logbook entries precisely, documentation Willa had not expected, but which strengthened the emerging case considerably. It was through further inquiry, this time at the District Lighthouse Board office in the regional port city, that Willa learned Orrin Tuttle, the supply contractor Marsh's entries had named, remained very much active in coastal commerce, having expanded his provisioning business considerably in the 9 years since Comfort Point's closure, and now holding contracts supplying not only lighthouses but several coastal trading posts and a modest fleet of fishing vessels, a prosperous and, by all outward appearance, entirely respectable figure in the regional maritime trade. Willa's inquiries could not remain entirely discreet, and word reached Tuttle himself within a matter of weeks, carried perhaps by a clerk at the board's district office who mentioned, in passing conversation, that a young woman had been asking pointed questions about old supply records from the Comfort Point station. Tuttle came to Comfort Point himself on a blustery afternoon in early spring, a broad, weathered man of considerable bulk, whose manner carried the easy, practiced geniality of someone accustomed to smoothing over difficulties with charm, before resorting to anything more direct. He expressed at the outset a kind of avuncular concern that a struggling young woman should waste her limited resources chasing old maritime records that could only distress families who had long since made peace with an old tragedy, and he offered, with the confident air of a man used to having such offers accepted, to purchase Comfort Point from her outright at a sum considerably beyond what the ruined property could reasonably fetch, framing it as simple charitable assistance to a young woman clearly struggling to establish herself. When Willa declined, politely but without hesitation, explaining that she had not yet decided what she intended to do with the property, Tuttle's geniality cooled with a swiftness that told her a great deal about the man beneath the practiced charm. He reminded her, in the careful, deniable phrasing powerful men favor when delivering threats they wish never to be quoted directly, that a young woman alone on an isolated point depended a great deal on maintaining cordial relations with the established men of the coast, and that such relations, once soured, were not easily repaired, particularly for someone with so little standing to begin with. Willa was frightened by the visit, an honest fear she would not later pretend away, standing as she did entirely alone on an isolated point, with nothing but old papers and her own conviction to sustain her against a man of genuine regional influence. But she found, much as her father had found strength through countless solitary night watches when no one else stood between the light and the darkness pressing against it, that fear did not require paralysis, only caution. She continued her careful work, traveling to the port city to consult the board's own archived supply manifests from that period, records which, cross-referenced against Marsh's logbook entries, showed precisely the pattern of discrepancy he had documented, gaps between ordered and delivered quantities that no honest accounting could explain away as simple record-keeping error, particularly once repeated across 4 consecutive months and multiple coastal stations. It was a sympathetic clerk at the board's district office, a careful, soft-spoken man named Silas Whitfield, who had himself served briefly as a keeper's assistant before an injury moved him to administrative work, who finally helped Willa understand the fullest shape of what she'd uncovered. Whitfield, reviewing the old manifests alongside Marsh's logbook entries with genuine professional alarm, confirmed that the pattern extended beyond Comfort Point alone, that at least 2 neighboring stations along that stretch of coast had filed similar, though less thoroughly documented, complaints about supply quality during that same period, complaints that had gone similarly unaddressed before those keepers, too, had eventually stopped raising the matter. Whitfield agreed, once Willa laid the full weight of her evidence before him, that the matter merited formal reconsideration by the board's regional inspector, a review that had never properly occurred at the time because Marsh's dismissal had conveniently removed the primary complainant before his formal report could be filed and investigated. The formal inquiry that followed, convened some months later at the district Lighthouse board office and attended, at Whitfield's careful arrangement, by representatives of several affected families, including Sarah Marsh and, most significantly, 3 surviving relatives of passengers lost aboard the Abigail Rose, who had traveled considerable distance upon learning that new evidence concerning the wreck had come to light, proved considerably more thorough than the town hall dramatics of smaller coastal disputes, but no less decisive in its outcome. Willa presented Marsh's logbook pages and letter, Whitfield presented the corroborating supply manifests, and Sarah Marsh offered her husband's personal correspondence describing his mounting alarm in the months before his dismissal, a body of evidence that, laid before board officials with genuine authority to act, proved impossible to dismiss as the fabrication or grievance-seeking that Orrin Tuttle, present and increasingly desperate in his denials, attempted to characterize it as. The board's own subsequent investigation into Tuttle's supply contracts, prompted by the inquiry's findings, uncovered financial records showing a pattern of billing for full-grade materials while delivering measurably inferior substitutes across numerous coastal contracts extending well beyond Comfort Point alone, a scheme that had evidently continued, undetected or unchallenged, for the better part of a decade after Marsh's inconvenient dismissal removed the one keeper willing to document it formally. Tuttle's contracts with the Lighthouse Board were terminated within the month, and while the passage of 9 years placed any criminal prosecution beyond practical reach under the maritime commercial law of that era, the board's public acknowledgement of the diversion scheme and its direct connection to the Abigail Rose's loss accomplished something Willa had not fully anticipated when she began her careful inquiries. It restored, to 11 grieving families who had carried the wreck for 9 years as simple, senseless misfortune, the far harder but ultimately more bearable truth that their loss had been preventable, documented, and worthy of the grief they'd never been permitted to direct anywhere but at the indifferent sea itself. Elijah Marsh's name was formally cleared in the board's revised record. His dismissal for conduct unbecoming a keeper struck and replaced with a posthumous acknowledgement of diligent service and unheeded warning, a correction that moved Sarah Marsh to tears when Silas Whitfield delivered the news to her in person. Tears, she told Willa afterward, were the first she'd shed in years that carried relief alongside grief. The board, in recognition of both the historical injustice uncovered and the practical value of Comfort Point's sound tower structure, approached Willa the following season with an offer she had not sought, but accepted with the same steady practicality her father had modeled throughout his own long career. Reinstatement of Comfort Point as an active, staffed light, given the tower's proven soundness and the coast's continued need for its guidance. With Willa herself, given her demonstrated expertise and her family's long service to the board, appointed as the station's official keeper, the first woman in that district ever to hold the post outright rather than as an unofficial assistant to a father or husband. We began this story by telling you of a young woman, cast off by a calculating uncle with $5 to her name, who spent every last cent on a crumbling, abandoned lighthouse the whole coast considered a fool's purchase. That woman was Willa Prentiss Boone, and what she carried into Comfort Point was never merely her father's technical training, though that training mattered enormously in recognizing a sound structure others had too easily dismissed as ruin. She carried, more essentially, his conviction that duty performed without witness matters exactly as much as duty performed before an audience, and that a true record, however long buried, creates an obligation in whoever finds it to see the truth properly delivered. She looked at a lighthouse the whole coast had already condemned as cursed and worthless, and rather than accept that verdict, she tested it with a keeper's trained patience, and in doing so, she recovered not merely a livelihood for herself, but a truth 11 families had waited 9 years, without knowing it, to finally receive. Thank you for spending this time with Willa's story, and with us. If her father's quiet conviction that the work is owed whether or not anyone is watching speaks to something in your own life, we hope you'll share this story with someone who needs that reminder today. Before you go, tell us in the comments, what is a time you found real value or real truth in something everyone else had already written off? We are grateful, always, for the stories you share with us in return. Until next time, stay close.